The smell of smoke reached the narrow passage behind the still room before any sound did, and Anat Renfeld pressed her back against the cold plaster and did not breathe. Somewhere below her, a man was moving through Damerow Hall with a candle he did not need, opening doors he had no right to open, and she had seen his face by lamplight an hour before and understood, all at once, that she was the thing he had come to find. She held a folded square of parchment against her ribs beneath her apron. It was warm from her body, and it weighed nothing, and it was, she now knew, the only reason a man would walk a sleeping house at 2 a.m. with a tinderbox in his coat and murder arranged behind his eyes like furniture in a darkened room. A board settled in the floor above. She flinched and steadied. The servant's stair was 3 steps to her left. The green baize door that separated their world from the family's was at the top of it. And she had spent 4 months learning every loose tread in that house the way a sailor learns the set of a coast, because a woman who keeps a secret learns the floors first. She knew which board spoke. She knew which would betray her. What she did not yet know, crouched in that black passage with her heart loud in her throat, was that the master of the house had already risen, had already smelled what she smelled, and was at that moment coming down through the dark, with no candle at all, hunting through every room of his own home, for the one person in it he could not afford to lose. You may think you know how a story like this ends. Stay with it a while. The night was not finished with any of them. 4 months earlier she had come to Damerow Hall on foot, with a single box and a character reference written in a careful clerk's hand that named her Anat Renfeld, formerly stillroom assistant to a vicar's widow in the next county, sober, clean, and willing. Every word of it was a lie, except her given name. And she had kept her given name only because a woman who forgets to answer to herself is a woman who is caught. She had not always been a servant. That was the part she carried folded smaller than the parchment and showed to no one. And her father had been a gentleman of modest acres and immodest hopes, and he had put both into a canal scheme that a sharper man than he had drawn on paper and never meant to dig. When the scheme collapsed, it took the acres, the house, and within the year, her father himself, who had gone to bed one October night with a weight on his chest he called indigestion and did not wake. Her mother had died when Anat was 9. There were no brothers. There was an aunt in Bath who had made it plain, in a letter scented with disapproval, that a girl of 21 with no portion and a ruined name was a charity she could not afford to be seen extending. So Anat had done the arithmetic of her own survival at a kitchen table that no longer belonged to her, and it came out one way only: a lady without money as a burden, a servant without a past as a wage. She had cut up her 2 good gowns for plainer ones, roughened her hands deliberately at the scullery, learned to keep her eyes down and her voice level, and walked into the only life left open, to a woman who would not sell the other thing the world offered to buy. Damerow Hall took her because the housekeeper, Mrs. Loxby, was short a pair of hands in the still-room and disinclined to be particular about a girl who could read a recipe and would not flirt with the grooms. The still-room suited Anat. It was a low, cool stone chamber at the cold end of the house, lined with shelves of jars and bottles and bunches of drying herbs, and there she distilled rosewater and made the cordials and the salves and the lavender for the linen presses, and there mostly she was let alone. A woman who wishes to be invisible should learn a useful craft, and practice it where the family does not go. The family did not, in those first weeks, go anywhere. The master of Damerow was the Duke, and the Duke did not entertain. The county had a word for him, and the word repeated in shops and at gates and over the low garden walls of the village of Saltmere was cold. Mrs. Loxby said it first, on Anat's 3rd day, drying a cup with a cloth and not looking up. To this house, she said, His Grace is a cold man, and you would do well not to be caught in his way. He had buried a great grief some years back, she would not say what, and he had buried his warmth alongside it. Anat heard the word again at the end of her 2nd week in the laundry, from an undermaid named Brindle, who said it plainly, and with the relish of the young for a master they may safely dislike. A cold man, Brindle said, wringing a sheet, that never laughs and never dances and walks his own halls at night, like he has lost something he is too proud to name. And Anat, folding linen, kept her face still, and thought that she, of all people, had no business judging the manner of another's grief. She saw him for the first time on a gray afternoon in her 3rd week, and she understood at once that the county had described his surface and missed the man underneath it. She had carried a tray of cordial to the small library, because the footman was lame that day, and she had not known the Duke was in it. He stood at the long window with his back to the door, tall and broad through the shoulder, in a dark coat without ornament, and the light through the glass fell across a face that was not cold so much as carefully held, the way a man holds a cup he is afraid of spilling. He had gray eyes the color of wood smoke, and a hard set to his mouth, and a thin pale scar along the line of his left jaw that she would later learn the cause of and wish she had not. He looked at the tray. He said, "Only set it there." His voice low and level, and she set it there and went out, and her hands were not quite steady, and she told herself it was the weight of the tray. That was the first time P.A. There were others, accidental and brief, across the long autumn. She came to know his movements the way she knew the floors. He rose before the house and walked the grounds in all weathers. He ate alone. He spent his evenings in the muniment room at the cold end of the house near her still-room, where the estate's deeds and ledgers and the long history of Damerow were kept in iron-bound presses, and through the wall some nights she heard the scrape of a chair and the turning of pages, and once, very low, a sound that a less attentive woman would have called nothing, and that Anat, who knew the vocabulary of grief, knew for what it was. She learned the shape of his sorrow, slowly and without meaning to. The portrait that hung in the shadowed end of the long gallery of a girl of perhaps 16, with the Duke's own gray eyes and a sprig of something pinned at her breast, was always, she noticed, kept dusted when the rest of that wing was let go. Mrs. Loxby told her the rest one evening over the mending, in the flat voice of a woman repeating a thing the house had agreed not to speak of. His Grace had a younger sister. There had been a fire, years past, in the old west wing at night. He had got himself out and gone back for her, and not reached her in time, and the scar along his jaw was from the beam that fell as they carried him clear. He had pulled down the burned wing to the foundations and never built upon it. And from that night, Mrs. Loxby said he could not abide a fire left untended, and walked the house himself before he slept, to see every great banked safe, which the county took for the strangeness of a cold man, and which Anat, hearing it, understood for the opposite of cold. So when she thought of him, after that she did not think the county's word. She thought of a man who walked his own dark halls, counting the souls under his roof, because he had once been unable to save one of them. It was a dangerous thing to understand about a person. Understanding is the beginning of being unable to look away. She kept to her still-room. She made her cordials and her salves. She answered to Renfeld and bobbed to her betters, and let the household believe her exactly what her character described. And she might have passed the whole of her service, so invisible and safe, had a carriage not turned in at the Damerow gates on a wet evening in late November, bearing a gentleman the servants' hall had been dreading for a fortnight. Sir Pelham Voce was the Duke's cousin on the distaff side, a man of perhaps 35, with a handsome, ruined face and a way of looking at a room as though pricing its contents. He came, he said, on family business, and he stayed, and the household understood within a day the kind of guest he was. He spoke to the upper servants as though they were furniture, and to the lower as though they were not there. He kept late hours and rang his bell at all of them. And he watched the Duke across the dinner table, Mrs. Loxby reported, with the particular patience of a man who believes a thing is owed him and means to collect. What was owed him, the servants' hall worked out in pieces, was Damerow itself. The estate was entailed, but the entail had a flaw in it, an old uncertainty in the line, and Sir Pelham had spent 2 years and a great deal of borrowed money in London courts arguing that the title and lands ought, by rights, to come to him should the present Duke die without a son, which the present Duke, a childless widower who did not entertain, showed no sign of remedying. It was a slow suit and a costly one, and a gentleman who has spent 2 years and borrowed money on a slow suit is a gentleman in want of a faster road. Annet learned the rest of it by the accident of being where servants are presumed not to matter. She had been sent to the muniment room one afternoon to carry away a basin and cloths after the chimney sweep, and Sir Pelham had been within at the great press where the deeds were kept, and he had not heard her enter on the soft still-room shoes she wore. He stood with a candle and a fold of paper pressed to the lock of the press, taking, she saw with a slow, cold clarity, the impression of the key in soft wax. He had the steward's ring of keys in his other hand. The steward. Hartle's ring that Mr. Hartle would never have surrendered, and which meant the steward had been gotted one way or another. Sir Pelham looked up and saw her in the doorway with her basin, and his face did a thing then that she would remember, that went, for half a breath, entirely blank. Then it smiled, and the smile was worse. He said, "You may take that away, girl." And she bobbed and took it away, and did not let her hands shake until she was through the door. She told herself it was none of her affair. She told herself a servant who sees things and forgets them, the servant who keeps her place. She held to that for 3 days. On the 4th she could not, because on the 4th she went into the muniment room at dusk on her own errand, for a jar of the beeswax she kept on a high shelf there, and she found, in passing, that the great press now opened to a touch. Its lock turned, and she stood with a candle and looked at what a frightened man with a borrowed key had been at, and she could not afterward unsee it. What was in the press was the history of Damerow, and most of it was dull, and one thing was not. There was a codicil, drawn in the late Duke's hand and witnessed and sealed, that settled a portion of the estate's lesser holdings upon a charitable trust for the relief of the village of Saltmere, the almshouses, and the school and the widow's coal in perpetuity, and named the present Duke and his lawful heirs the trustees of it. Annet, who had been a gentleman's daughter and had read deeds before her ruin, understood what she held faster than she wished to. A document that named the present Duke and his lawful heirs, the keepers of a perpetual trust, was a document that assumed the line would continue. It was, more to the point, a document witnessed and dated in a hand and on a day that, if she read the older deeds beneath it, rightly gave the lie to the very flaw in the entail on which Sir Pelham's whole London suit was built. The codicil did not merely give bread to widows. It cut the ground from under a desperate man's 2 years of borrowed hope, and it was loose in a press whose lock had been copied in wax by that same desperate man. She stood a long time in the cold room with a candle burning down. A wiser servant, she thought, would put the jar back and the codicil back, and close the press, and remember nothing. A wiser servant would not have a gentleman's reading of a deed. A wiser servant would not have lain awake the past 3 nights hearing, through the wall, the low sound a grieving man makes when he believes the house asleep. She was not, it seemed, going to be a wiser servant. She took the codicil out of the press, folded it small and put it inside the bodice of her gown next to her skin, where it was warm and weighed nothing, and she closed the press and put the empty press to rights as best she could and went back to her still room, and from that hour she was no longer invisible. Though no one yet knew it but her, and the man whose key would not, when he next tried it, find what he had come for. It is a strange thing to carry another person's ruin, folded against one's own heart. For a day and a night she carried it, and did nothing, paralyzed by the size of the thing and the smallness of her standing. Who would believe a still-room maid against a baronet? If she went to the Duke, she must explain how she came to read a deed, and the explanation was the whole of her hidden life. If she went to anyone else, she did not trust the going. So, she carried it, and she watched Sir Pelham at his bell and his late hours, and she saw him go twice more to the muniment room, and come out twice with a face that had begun beneath its handsome ruin to look afraid. A frightened man who has lost the thing that would damn him is a man who reasons that someone has taken it. A man who reasons that someone has taken it begins to look at the servants. He began to look at her. She felt it at dinner service when she carried in the second course because the house was short-staffed and the under-footman ill. felt his eyes find her and hold, felt the moment he remembered the girl with the basin in the doorway. She kept her face the careful blank she had learned and set down the dish and withdrew, and behind her she heard him say something low to his man, and she did not need to hear the words to know the sense of them. That same evening, the Duke spoke to her for the first time as a man speaks to a person, and not a tray. She had been late closing the still room, the lavender bunches needing to be turned, and he had come down the cold passage on his nightly round to see the grates banked, and he found her there by a single candle, with her sleeves pushed up and her hands full of dried lavender, and he stopped in the doorway as though he had forgotten the room contained a person. He looked at her hands. He looked longer than a duke looks, at a still-room maid at her face. Then he said, "You are still about," his voice low, and she said, "Yes, your grace, the linen." And he said nothing for a moment that went on too long, and then he said the thing she would turn over for nights. After, he said, "You watch this house. I have seen you do it." And she did not know how to answer that, so she answered with the truth, dressed as a servant's deference, and said, "A body learns where she stands, your grace." And something in his held face moved, the smallest thing, the way ice moves on a river before it goes, and he said, "Good night, Renfeld." And she stood in the lavender smell with her heart behaving very badly, and the codicil warm against her ribs, and understood that she was in a great deal more danger than the legal kind. What she did not know was that he had marked her long before that night. The Duke of Damerow had spent some years training himself to notice every soul under his roof, because once he had failed to reach one in time, and a man so trained notices a great deal. He had noticed that the new still-room girl read the labels on his sister's old physic jars, with the ease of a person who had been taught Latin. He had noticed that she set down a tray, the way a woman sets down a tray who has, in some other life, had trays set down for her. He had noticed, and said nothing, and added her quietly to the count of souls he kept, and told himself the interest he took was the interest a careful master takes in the strangeness of his household, and did not entirely believe himself. The county would have its word for him, and the county was wrong. For a man does not walk a house at night to save the living from a danger that already took the dead, unless something in him is the precise opposite of cold. The thing came to its head on the first hard frost of December, and it came, as these things do, at night. And it had been kept late again. She had heard, in the early part of the evening, raised voices from the direction of the steward's room, the Duke's level, and a second one she knew for Mr. Fodder. Hartles and she had gathered from a frightened brindle that the steward had broken at last, and gone to his master and confessed what Sir Pelham had pressed him to, the keys, the wax, the small betrayals of a man with a sick wife and a baronet's money held over him. The Duke, Brindle said, had not shouted. He had only grown very quiet and very still, and asked Mr. Hartle one question. "Where is the codicil now?" And Mr. said, Hartle had not been able to answer it, because the codicil was gone from the press and no one in that room knew. It was folded small against the ribs of the girl who made the cordials. Annette lay awake in the narrow bed of the small chamber she shared with no one, at the cold end of the servants' wing above the still-room, and she thought she ought to go down at once and give the thing to the Duke, and let the truth out, and have done. She had got as far as putting her shawl about her shoulders when she heard, below and to the side, the sound that stopped her. A door, softly tried, then another. The careful progress of a man who is searching a sleeping-house, and does not wish to be heard searching it. She knew, without seeing, whose progress it was. A frightened baronet whose steward has just confessed and whose damning deed is missing, does not sleep. He hunts. And he had reasoned his way, as a frightened man reasons, to the only person who could have taken what he could not find, the girl with the basin, the girl who watched the house, the still-room maid who slept above the very room where the deeds were kept. And then she smelled the smoke. It came thin at first, a wrongness in the cold air, and then less thin, and she understood the whole of his plan in the space of a held breath, the way you understand a drop the instant your foot finds no floor. He had not come only to find her. He had come to burn the muniment room, the press, the deeds, the codicil he believed still in it, and to let the fire do the rest, the fire that would account for a great deal in a sleeping house, a fire that, if it happened also to find a troublesome still room made in her bed above the burning room, would be called a tragedy and not a murder. He meant the flames to give him back his suit and take from him his witness in a single night's work. And he had chosen, of all the houses in England, to set a fire in the one whose master could not abide one. This is where I must stop and tell you that she did not scream, and that her not screaming was the bravest thing she did all that long year, because a scream would have brought him to her door and not to the fire. She rose without a sound. She put the codicil into the bodice of her gown, where it had lived for a week. She did not light a candle. She went out of her chamber, into the black passage of the servants' wing, on the soft shoes that made no sound, and on the floors she knew the voice of, and she went, not down where he was, but along, toward the back stair that the family never used, and that he could not know, and below her she could hear now the small, dreadful sounds of a fire taking hold. The crackle, the sigh of air drawn into a hungry room, and she pressed her back to the cold plaster of the passage, behind the still room, and made herself breathe slow and held the parchment against her heart. She heard him below her. She heard the muniment room door and his voice, low, swearing softly, the swearing of a man who has set his fire and now cannot find his witness and is beginning to be afraid of his own cleverness. He went room to room below. She heard the green baize door at the foot of the servants' stair open. He was coming up, and she heard then the other thing. Above the crackle and below her own loud heart, on the family side of the baize door, a second set of feet, swift and sure and without a candle, taking the great stair down two at a time and then turning, unhesitating, toward the cold end of the house, toward the smoke, toward the servants' wing. A man who knows his house in the dark the way she knew the floors. A man who had smelled, in his sleep, the one smell he had trained his whole grieving body to wake to. The Duke was coming down. The Duke was hunting too, though not to silence her. The Duke was hunting to reach her before the fire did, and to find in the smoke the soul his count told him was up there, the still-room girl who slept above the burning room, the one person under his roof. He had this time the chance to reach in time. Two men moved through the dark toward her, and she crouched in the passage between them with the proof of everything against her ribs. And the smoke came up the stair like water filling a hold, and she made the only choice the night left her. She would not be found by the man below. She would be found by the man above, and she would put into his hands the thing that would end it. She left the safety of the passage behind the still room, and went toward the smoke and the second set of feet, toward the Duke, calling out at last, low and clear, not a scream but a summons, the master's name and her own purpose in 4 words. "Here, your grace, here." He came out of the smoke and found her. There was no candle, and the fire's light reached them red along the passage wall, and his face when it came was not held at all, now was stripped to the man under the surface, and he had her by the shoulders, both hands. The way the visual of every story like this wants its lord to take its lady, except that there was nothing charged in it yet, and everything kept only a man's 2 hands closing hard on the arms of a living person he had reached in time. "Are you hurt?" he said, low and fast. She said she was not. He said, "Where is the stewards? Where is the press?" And she did not waste the breath on explaining how she came to have it. She took the warm, folded parchment from her bodice and put it into his hand, and closed his fingers over it with both of hers, and said the only thing that mattered. "He set the fire to burn this. I took it out a week ago. He is in the house, below us, and he came up the servants' stair to find me." She felt the change go through him at that. The whole man, like the snap of a frozen branch. He looked at the parchment in his hand. He looked at the smoke. He looked at her, and for one moment that she would keep, his gray eyes held hers with no rank in them at all, only a terrible gladness. The gladness of a man who has been given, once, late, the thing he was never given the first time, the chance to carry a soul out of the smoke alive. Then he put the codicil inside his own coat, against his own ribs where hers had carried it, and he put her behind him, and he turned to meet the man on the stair. It did not become violence, because the Duke of Damerot had learned long ago what fire takes, and would not let this one take a man's life to spend his own rage, and because the house by then was waking. The fire that Sir Pelham had set to be a quiet tragedy had not been quiet enough. Mr. Rye, Hartle, who could not sleep for his shame, had smelled it almost as soon as his master, and was already on the stair below with 2 grooms and a chain of buckets forming from the yard pump. And the muniment room, stone-walled and iron-pressed at the cold end of the house, was the worst room in England to burn down and the best to put out, scorched and smoking and ruined of its papers, but standing before it could reach the timber of the wing above. And Sir Pelham Voce, coming up the servants' stair to murder a girl in the confusion of a blaze, met instead his cousin the Duke at the head of it, with the household roused below and the fire already losing, and a folded parchment that he could see, even in that light, even at that distance, in the Duke's hand. He tried, even then. Give a desperate man credit for his nerve. He drew himself up on the dark stair and named the codicil a forgery, named the girl a thief, and a fire-setter caught in her own crime, named the steward a liar, suborned to ruin an honest claimant, and he had, Annet would learn, the documents in his lodging in London to make a noise of it, a deed of his own drawing. A witness or two bought against a lean season. He did not crumble. He fought, in the only arena he understood, the arena of paper and claim, and the long machinery of the law. And he meant to fight it all the way back to the courts where he had spent his 2 years and turned the night, with money and patience, into the very proof of the Duke's unfitness he had come to manufacture. That was the active and dangerous thing about Sir Pelham, and it is why it mattered that the girl who undid him had not undone him by luck. She had read the deed. She had taken it, a week before he could burn it. She had carried it through a burning house and put it into the right hand, and there is no quantity of bought witnesses that survives the original codicil witnessed and sealed and dated, laid open on a magistrate's table by a woman who can read it aloud, and say where every other deed in that press contradicts the claim. He had foresight. She had more. That reckoning, though, belonged to the daylight, and the daylight was hours off. And first there was the rest of that night to live through, the buckets and the smoke and the slow gray realization spreading through a roused household that the new still-room maid had not slept through, the fire that nearly killed her but had walked through it carrying the thing that would save the house. The Duke had Sir Pelham confined to his chamber under the eye of the 2 grooms. No chains, no blow, only a closed door and a man set at it, and the magistrate sent for to come at first light. And when the muniment room was black and steaming and safe, and the household stood about the smoke-stained passage in their nightclothes, not knowing what to do with themselves, the Duke came back to where Annet stood against the wall with the soot on her face, and her hands raw from helping pass the buckets. And the household watched, and he did not. Then, say any of the great things a lord in such a moment is supposed to say. He took off his own coat and put it round her shoulders, because she was shaking with the cold that comes after. And he said, "Lo, you will not go back up there tonight." And he had Mrs. Loxby take her to the warm kitchen and sit her by the banked range with a cup of something hot, and he stood in the doorway of his own kitchen a moment, looking at her among his servants, the soot, the borrowed coat too big across her shoulders, the unbroken steadiness of her after everything. And the household saw their cold master look at the still-room maid, the way no one had seen him look at anything since the west wing burned. The morning brought the magistrate, and the magistrate brought the law, and the law, for once, was not slow. It is slow when the proof is thin. It is quick when a sealed codicil lies open on the table, and a clear-voiced woman reads it, and lays beside it the older deeds that the claim depends on misreading, and a broken steward weeps out the truth of the wax and the keys, and the very fire the claimant set to destroy the proof has, instead, roused a houseful of witnesses to his climbing the servant's stair toward a sleeping girl. Sir Pelham's deed of his own drawing did not survive the codicil. His bought witnesses had not yet arrived from London, and hearing how the night had gone, did not trouble to come. His 2 years of borrowed hope ended in a single gray morning in a scorched house, not with a duel, not with a blow, but with the quiet closing of the machinery he had trusted, turning, at the last, against him. He was not destroyed. He was undone, which is a different and a smaller thing. The suit was struck. The debts he had raised against his expectations fell due against a man with no expectations, and he went out of Damerow under the magistrate's escort a ruined gentleman, corrected by the law he had tried to bend, and the county, telling it after, agreed that he had been the author of his own undoing. Which is the truest thing the county ever agreed about anyone. It was the magistrate, reading the codicil aloud in his turn before the assembled household, who said the thing that brought Annette's other life into the room at last. He came to a line in the older deed beneath the codicil that named the families of the district who had once held land of Damerow, and he read, among them the name of Renfeld, a small gentleman's holding sold off 2 generations back, and he looked up half idle and asked was there any of that name still in the county. And into it the Duke said, looking, not at the magistrate, but at the girl in the borrowed coat, there is one. And Anat, who had kept her secret 4 months, and through a fire found that she had no wish left to keep it, and she stood and gave her own name plainly, her father's name, and his ruin, and the canal scheme, and the aunt in Bath, the whole folded smallness of her life laid open, like the codicil on the table. And she watched it land in that room of servants and gentry. And she did not lower her eyes while it landed. The Dowager Duchess of Damerow had come down by then. She was the Duke's mother, a straight, cold, handsome woman, who had been in the house all along, keeping to her own rooms, and who had taken it upon herself, from the first, to regard the still-room maid as one regards a draught from an ill-fitting window, a small, persistent impertinence. Lady Carrodus had said, more than once, in the hearing of servants who carried it down, that the girl Renfeld gave herself airs above her place, read where she had no business reading, and would come. Mark her to a bad end, the way such girls did. She had said it as a private aside to her companion. In the first week, she had said it more sharply in a public exchange in the morning-room where 2 footmen heard it, when the Duke had once asked the still-room maid a question at the foot of the stair. Peia. And she had said it the very evening before the fire, by way of a third-party report, when her companion brought up the new girl's strange habit of watching the house, and the dowager had answered that a watching servant was a thieving servant in waiting, and that her son was a fool to keep one. 3 times the same dismissal in 3 different rooms, and each time it had reached Annette by the underground channels of a servants' hall, and each time she had folded it small with the rest, and made her cordials and said nothing. Now the dowager stood at the edge of the scorched morning-room, and heard the still-room maid give her name as a gentleman's daughter, and watched her son look at the girl as he did, and the straight, cold, handsome face did a thing it was unused to doing. It faltered. Lady Carrodus was not a wicked woman. She was a woman whose entire long life had taught her that the order of things was the order of worth, that a maid was a maid and a lady, and the categories did not leak, and she had met now, in a single gray morning, a person her categories could not hold, a still-room girl who was a gentleman's daughter, a servant who had read a deed, a draught from an ill-fitting window, who had walked through fire to save the house that her son's whole inheritance, and the village's bread and the very roof above the dowager's head depended upon. She had been confidently, comprehensively wrong, in the way of people whom rank has insulated from the necessity of being right, and she was old enough, and under the coldness honest enough to know it when it stood before her with soot on its face. She did not make a speech. She said only to her son, in a low voice that the room was not meant to catch and caught, I judged her by her apron, and I was a fool, and she crossed the room, the Dowager Duchess of Damerow, and took the still-room maid's raw red hand in both of her ringed ones, briefly, and let it go. And that was the whole of her correction, and it was enough. Because it was true. The household, telling it after, said that was the moment the cold went out of Damerow Hall, but the household, as usual, was a little ahead of the facts. The cold did not go out of Damerow in a morning. Grief that has lived in a house since a west wing burned does not lift like a fog. What happened was slower and surer, and it is the truer part of the story. The Duke did not declare himself. He was not a declaring man, and the grain of his nature ran to the thing done rather than the thing said. Through the short December that followed, while the muniment room was cleared, and the codicil lodged safe with the trust it created, while the village of Saltmere learned that its almshouses and its school and its widow's coal had been preserved by a still-room maid, and began, in the way of villages, to leave small grateful offerings at the Damereau kitchen door, the Duke did small things. He had the cold servants' chamber above the still-room given up and a warm one found for her, and would not be thanked for it. He came down on his nightly round to see the grates banked, and found more often than was accidental that he had business in the stone passage by the still-room at the hour Annot turned the lavender. He spoke to her, low and level, of small things, the cordials, the weather, the trust, his sister once, the only time he had named her aloud to anyone in years, standing in the still-room doorway with the lavender smell between them, telling her without ornament of the girl in the gallery portrait and the night of the beam and the long silence after. And Annot stood and received it the way she had received the dismissals, folded small and kept safe, except that this she would never need to hide. She came to know the warmth under the held surface, as she had once known the floors. He was not cold. He was a man who had banked his own fire after a fire took everything, and a banked fire is not a dead one, only one kept low against the dark, and it can be coaxed back by the right slow hands. She did not coax. She made her cordials and answered his questions, and let him stand in her doorway, and the awareness between them grew the way frost grows, on glass, intricate and silent and everywhere at once, until the whole household felt it and held its breath, and the only two people who did not speak of it were the two it belonged to. It was the dowager in the end who forced the matter. The dowager corrected and made by her correction kinder. Who said to her son across the dinner table one January night, in front of the servants, with the bluntness of an old woman who has decided to stop being a fool, that he would be a greater fool than she had been if he let pride or rank keep him from a woman who had carried his whole house out of a fire against her own heart, and that a duke might marry where he found worth and let the county make of it what it would. And the duke, who had needed perhaps only to be told aloud that the thing was permitted, set down his glass and was quiet a long moment, and then he rose, in front of the household, and went down to the still-room himself, where Annot was at the lavender, and the household, which had learned by then to follow its master at a discreet distance on the nights that mattered, gathered in the dark of the passage and watched through the half-open door. He stood in the doorway as he had stood the first night. He looked at her hands full of lavender. He looked at her face. And then he did the thing the whole long winter had been building toward, the calibrated thing, the single, sufficient thing. No speech, no paragraph, only what was needed and not one word past it. He crossed the small stone room, took both her raw hands in his, in the place where the hierarchy had first decided she was nothing, and he said, low and level and entirely certain, "Marry me, Annot, and be the lady of this house." 12 words, her given name in his voice for the first time. The marked event, a thing said once, never before. He had not foreshadowed it. He had not rehearsed it on her in the passage on any earlier night. He said it once in the still-room with the household, holding its breath in the dark behind him, and it was a name claimed and a place named in a defense of her worth made public in the only public that mattered. His own roused house, the same souls who had watched the cold master in the still-room maid all winter. She did not answer at once. She let the silence hold, the way the best moments hold, and the lavender was between them and the soot smell of the ruined room, not yet fully gone from the house. And she looked at the man who had been called cold by a county that had never once seen him walk his halls at night, counting the souls he loved. Then she set down the lavender. She freed one hand from his, only to lay it against the scarred line of his jaw. The old hurt, the night he had not reached his sister, the wound she had understood before she ever meant to. and she said the one honest sentence she had been unable to say in 4 months of keeping her place. "I have watched this house since the night I came, and I have been waiting for you to let me stay in it." And that was a yes, and he knew it, and the household in the dark passage knew it, and old Mrs. Bay. Loxby, who had told her on the 3rd day to keep out of the cold master's way, wept frankly into her apron, and did not care who saw. They were married in the spring, quietly, in the small church at Saltmere, with the village that her courage had kept inbred, filling the pews the almshouse widows in the front of them in their best, and the Dowager Duchess of Damerel, standing up for the bride she had once dismissed as a draught, because the county, telling it among themselves, had decided that a duke who married the woman who saved his house was not a duke who had married beneath him, but a duke who had for once married above the foolishness of his rank, and the county, when it finally gets a thing right, says so, as loudly as it once said the wrong thing. If their winter moved you, you might carry one small picture of them out of it, the way they carried each other out of the smoke. So let me leave you not at the church, but where the story truly lived, in the cold stone-still room at the end of the house, that Annet would not give up even when she became its lady, where she still made the cordials and the lavender for the linen presses, because a craft learned in necessity becomes in safety a love. There, on a high shelf, beside the jar of beeswax that had first sent her to the press where the codicil lay, she kept a small thing pressed flat between 2 squares of glass, a sprig of rue from the still-room garden, the bitter herb of grace and of remembrance that she had pinned, one spring morning, at the breast of the portrait in the gallery. The girl with the gray eyes who had not been reached in time, so that the lost sister should have at last a green thing kept fresh for her in a house that had learned again how to keep things. And on the worst of the winter nights, when the wind came off the frost and found the old scar in the weather of the house, the Duke of Damerel still rose, and walked his halls before he slept to see every grate banked safe the long habit of his grief. He did not walk them alone now, and he was no longer counting the souls he had failed to reach. He was counting the one he had, late and against every odds the night had stacked, reached in time, who walked the cold passages at his side with a candle they did not need, and turned at the foot of the servants' stair where it had all begun, and went up with him into the warm,